on elder care. My name is Casey Wagner. I'll be serving as the moderator today. Before I introduce the instructors for today's session, let me explain a few logistics about the webinar format. First, please note that while you'll be able to hear the instructor and the moderator, this format does not permit us to hear you. However, your questions are most welcome. If we don't get to all the questions that are posed today, any that aren't answered will be saved in our system, and we'll send those questions with the instructor's responses to all of you via email in the near future. Let me explain how you can pose your questions. Throughout the session, you'll see a blue box in the corner of your screen. At the bottom of the box are the words question and answer. If you click on that area, you'll open a drop-down box into which you can type questions to the instructor. As the moderator, I will see those questions come in and will pose them to the instructors at an appropriate time. When the session is over, our evaluation form will automatically appear on your monitor. Please take a moment to complete the evaluation so we can better assess the quality of our programming. The evaluation scale is 1 to 5. 1 is disagree with the statement, while 5 is enthusiastically agree. With all that said, I'd like to turn the program over to our instructors and welcome Cheryl Feldman and Makita Holly. When the session ends, please remember to complete the evaluation form that will show up on your monitor as we end today, and remember to watch your email for announcements of other Cornell programs. If you can provide us with emails for others who might be interested, please either enter the address in one of the comment boxes or send them in a separate email to amb27@cornell.edu. Thanks so much. Turning it over to Cheryl and Makita.
Hi, this is Cheryl Feldman, and I'm really happy to be with you today to talk about our program here in Philadelphia. Makita will also be sharing thoughts with you as we go through the presentation. Just a little bit about the training fund on the screen. You see pictures of students at our graduation. We have had a labor management training fund of approximately 50 healthcare employers in the Philadelphia area and District 1199C AFSCME for a very long time. We'll be celebrating our 40th anniversary next year. And we operate an educational institution in Philadelphia, serving about 4,000 people a year, and ensuring, we hope, that our students really get a great experience with us. We have students who are getting their GED and high school diploma, all the way through people getting their master's degrees and doing their PhD work. So it's a very large program of individuals at different points in their educational careers. And one of the things that we've really been excited about is our work in home care, which has actually been going on for quite a number of years, but has taken different forms at different points in time. So a little bit about our home care work. We've done our home care work in partnership with a group called Liberty Resources, which is a center for independent living, meaning that they are in the business of advocating for people with disabilities, many of whom are elderly, and helping those individuals to access home care services and also access other services that are going to support them to live at home and not be institutionalized. They also serve as a very strong advocacy group for the disabled. And when our organization began partnering with Liberty about 5 or 6 years ago, one of the beginning points of discussion was that they really disliked the medical model and wanted to ensure that in working with them and building a training program with them, that we would recognize the importance of consumer-directed care, where the disabled consumer, be it an elderly person or not, really was in the driver's seat in terms of working with the attendant to direct their own care. And in beginning to then think about a program that would enable the attendants to really learn the knowledge and skills and abilities that would ensure that they are providing quality care, we really need to think outside of the box about how this program could be developed so that Liberty Resources and the consumers really felt that this was something that was of them and for them, and where we were not imposing training that did not fit their philosophy. And so jointly we came up with the idea that we would actually offer joint training where the consumer and the attendant would together attend the training and really learn together and work on their partnership, their caregiving partnership together. And so we were able to develop a training with that premise. At the time when we developed the training, the Center for Independent Living had what was called the consumer-directed option, where instead of going through a home care agency, the consumers hired the attendants directly. Many hired family members, and some consumers used a hybrid model where they were their own employer for some hours of the day, and then they used a home care agency maybe at night for some other hours. Since the time when we developed the training, that has changed, and the state of Pennsylvania has imposed some rigid regulation, and the consumer option is now being contracted out to a for-profit company out of state. And so Liberty Resources has actually started its own home care agency, and we've been working with them to support them in this new endeavor. But what we're going to talk today about is what we developed initially and then replicated statewide, because we feel that the model we developed was really pretty interesting, and we got a lot of fiscal support from the state, and with that support we really created what I think would be considered a best practice model. That model right now isn't being implemented in the same way, but I think it's worth very much looking at what was developed. So I talked about the importance of the consumer in this advocacy model. And for those of you who are not familiar with independent living philosophy, a philosophy which supports people with disabilities living at home instead of an institutional setting, this was a very important part of the curriculum. And I'd like to turn the mic over to Makita to kind of give you a little bit of sense of what that meant in terms of the curriculum.
Okay, hi everyone. So the independent living philosophy is really kind of grounded in the idea that the consumer is the one to exert influence, all choices, and all control regarding really every aspect of their life. And so, I mean, I was telling Cheryl a little bit this morning that when I started on the project, I was very new to this framework. I had done work in home care before, but when it came to really kind of giving the power over to the consumer, that was new for me. And they're very vocal and very, I mean, they'll really explain this to anybody who has a question about it. And one of the first things where, you know, I really kind of got to see firsthand what they meant in action was when I was conducting or facilitating a training, and I was talking to home care workers, and I think that there were also some individuals from the SILs in the room, and I think the language I used was, you can allow your attendant, or you can allow, I said to the attendants, you can allow your consumer to, you know, do this particular area of their care. And it was quickly brought to my attention that, you know, it's not allowing in this model. We don't allow the consumers. The consumers are the ones who are really dictating how their care will take place and explaining to the attendant, in fact, you know, the best way for this care to happen. So that was just kind of a little example of, you know, one of the ways that with this training and when we moved to the statewide model that we ensured that we really were speaking to the need and allowing the independent living philosophy to come into all levels of our curriculum.
Yeah.
Thanks, Makita. And there'll be time for questions for sure if you have any. So the independent living philosophy became part of Building Bridges and was actually taught by the SIL staff and by the consumers themselves who became part of the faculty. We always have had an RN, a registered nurse, also teaching this course, and we would delve into the body systems and disease processes that were actually affecting the consumers in the class, be it diabetes, congestive heart failure, any disability that was being experienced, or any physical issues became part of the curriculum and often got customized for the class based on who was in the class. The technical skills taught in the class, very important. You know, the transference from a bed to a chair or vice versa, or a wheelchair, and all of the other technical skills in terms of activities of daily living and support of the consumer. And again, the partnership model was really highlighted where the consumer would actually, in pairs, work with their attendant and explain to them the best way that they wanted these skills to be carried out. Rather than just having the RN do it, the consumers were involved in that. And it really meant that there was a lot of communication going on between the consumer and attendant in very positive ways, a lot of relationship building between the consumers and attendants. Sometimes the family members were involved, obviously, who were taking care of their consumer family member with a disability, and we would do role reversal where the caregiver became the attendant, became the consumer, and the consumer became the caregiver. I remember one husband-wife team where we were teaching feeding skills to people who could not feed themselves, and the wife who was the consumer, the disabled consumer, was feeding her husband, who was the caregiver, and all of the discussion around how it felt and giving a sense to both parties about what it meant to sit in the other role, to live in that other space. So we wanted to give you just a very broad outline of some of the major curriculum areas. Relationship building is intertwined, you know, around the whole curriculum. And so this could look like a very traditional curriculum, but when you teach it in the way that I've described, it looks very, very different. Where you have the consumers and the attendants learning together, where questions of ethical practice come up, people's feelings come up. I've been part of, you know, privy to discussions that were so meaningful in terms of people sharing how it felt both on the caregiver side and the receiving side. And so when you go through a curriculum like this and you teach it from that vantage point, the learning that takes place is on a very different level than a traditional classroom. So here's one of our classes, and I think all of the people in the front row were disabled consumers, and in the back row there's a couple of consumers, but also a number of attendants, some of whom are family members. And the RN instructor is the second from the right for that particular class. And so the feeling of camaraderie, not only in the pairs of consumers and attendants, but between everybody in the classroom is really a phenomenal experience. People don't feel alone. They're part of a community. I just wanted to share with you some of the roles in terms of how we work together with this SIL. We divided responsibilities up and were able to work very well together. The SIL recruited the incumbent attendants and their consumers. We hired the instructors and directed the curriculum delivery. The SIL handled all the administrative tasks regarding the attendants and consumers. So one of the major commitments that the SIL made was to pay the attendants for all the training hours, and also ensure that the consumers had the transportation to get to training and back. And then another big role beyond that the fund played, which is part of our philosophy, is to promote continuing education and career advancement opportunities for all the attendants. And if anybody has questions about what that consisted of, certainly happy to help explain that more. Another big deal beyond even getting certificates, and this is a consumer at a graduation ceremony receiving her certificate for completing the training, was that every attendant received a wage increase as a result of attending the training. And this was built in as a beginning principle, and there was decisions made up front as to what the wage increase would be, and that was a very big deal for the program. So on-the-job training where people are being paid for their time in the class and the wage increase were certainly an important part of the success of the program. We also developed continuing education modules for the attendants on specific diseases and disease processes. A lot of the attendants we have found over time really needed higher levels of care in their home, including ventilators and other complex processes. And so we were able, mental health issues, cognitive impairment issues, so we were able, beyond the basic foundation training, to develop specific education modules that were offered post-training in smaller segments. And that became also part of what was available to the attendants. So at this point I wanted to break before we talk about our statewide model and give anyone who is interested in, at this point, a chance to ask questions. We'll also have time at the end, but I wanted to see at this point whether there were any particular questions people had.
Hi, it's Casey. One question is, what does incumbent attendants and consumers mean?
Good question. Good question. Incumbent means that the attendant is working for the consumer. It's not somebody who was newly hired. This was not taught initially as a new hire program. Since that time, we have expanded it to new hires. But at the initial trainings that were offered, it was offered to attendants that were already working with their consumers. And where there was already in place the relationship. So we were building on skills that may or may not have existed previously, because the basically most of the attendants who had, some of them been working long term, had never really had any training whatsoever. And so the program was really trying to promote quality care and the relationship building I referred to. And so by working with people who are already employed, we really focused on improving the skill set of the attendants working. And the consumers are the people who are receiving the care. And the training was offered to the consumer attendant pair, to the consumer and the attendants who worked for that consumer. Sometimes it would be one attendant, and sometimes a consumer would bring several attendants to the training.
What was the average age of the consumers who took part in the code training? And a follow-up is, how does it work in the case of consumers with dementia and Alzheimer's?
Okay. So the average age of the consumer varied tremendously. As you saw in the picture, we had some young consumers, and we had quite a number of elderly consumers. It was a complete range, very diverse. We had young people with cognitive impairment where their particular illness had affected their brain functioning, and we had elderly with dementia and Alzheimer's. And our instructor had to be very flexible in terms of how people work together, how the consumers and attendants work together. I have to say that I don't believe we had anyone where the cognitive brain functioning was such that they couldn't communicate. But as long as there was some level of understanding and communication, it would work. But I don't believe that this was a voluntary program that consumers had to volunteer to be part of it. So I don't believe we had any consumers volunteer who couldn't really understand what was going on. So as a voluntary program, it probably weeded out people with, the severe impairment.
I have 3 more questions about the number of attendants who were trained in total. Did many attendants take advantage of the continuing education? And then finally, when you talk about the wage increase, where was that money coming from? Was it, because is it a sole source of money, and how might you see that with individual employers in their homes, as opposed to what I'm assuming might have been a funding stream from the state?
Okay. We have trained several hundred consumers since Building Bridges began. We would have cohorts of up to 20 people, 10 consumers and 10 attendants. And we've taught numerous cohorts because it extended over a 5 to 6 year time period. And a cohort would last maybe 3 months, 4 months. And so over the course of the year, we could do 2 to 3 cohorts. And when we did it statewide, we did 6 cohorts at a time, and we repeated it twice. So we've trained several hundred people. In terms of the continuing education modules, we were only able to offer that for a few cohorts when the state was supporting that activity. When they were supporting it, I would say there was probably about a 75%, I may be exaggerating a little because I don't have the exact numbers, but I'd say 65 to 75% rate of participation of those consumers who were in building bridges who continued into the continuing ed modules. And at that time, it was a special one-year grant we had. It included a career coach from our staff, and we were working with those particular attendants not only for the continuing ed modules, but to work on their academic skills, because we have an academic program here. And a number of them went on to become students in nurse aid, practical nursing, and even registered nursing programs. I remember one of the attendants got a scholarship to become a registered nurse from that cohort. So when we have that kind of support from a funding source, you can really do a lot more in-depth work than you can when you're working on a shoestring. In terms of the pay wage increase, you're right, Casey, that the raises came from state funds to the attendants. It was still a big sacrifice on the part of the Center for Independent Living to put that aside in their budget. But everybody agreed that it was a win-win for not only the attendants, but for the quality of care for the consumers. How it works for individual employers would be something that I think would require further discussion, but I certainly think if there was an organization that was supporting this, maybe there could be some kind of standard set that could be shared with consumers, you know, to help with that kind of decision-making process and ensure that folks that are spending time and getting the skills they need to provide quality care are valued for that.
All finished with questions at this moment. Back to the presenters.
Okay, so I'm going to turn this over then to Makita, who is going to talk about our statewide program.
Okay. So out of, or what really inspired, you know, our growth since the state of Pennsylvania was the work that Cheryl just spoke of with the one SIL in Philadelphia, Liberty Resources. So Liberty Resources is part of a consortium of SILs across the country, across the state, who are all very committed to doing this training work. And while I would say that there's probably about 20 to 25, 6 of them were particularly interested in coming together and very committed to you know, taking on the training that Liberty Resources had done in partnership with us and really modeling this this same training at their sites. So we did come together and we were able to target these 6 geographic areas across the state of Pennsylvania. So there were 22 counties total to develop what we thought was a really, you know, kind of rich and innovative training model that took what the work that we started with Liberty Resources and really build upon it by adding in some key components. So one of, you know, the things that we received funding for. And so this was all funding that came through the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, who at that time, so this was about 3 or 4 years ago, was very committed to ensuring that this training happened and that like trainings happened for home care workers. I think obviously in a different way than what we're seeing right now. So, what we outlined was that, we would strive to improve the consumer and worker job satisfaction at each of these CILs. We wanted to ensure that participants would leave with home health aid certifications and also first aid and CPR certifications. So both consumers and attendants receive that CPR and first aid certification. The goal was really to come up with some standardization around the training curriculum. So that was, another big step and a big lift for us. And then similarly to the work that we started in Philadelphia with Liberty Resources, we wanted to ensure that each of the CILs who participated were committed to providing the hourly wage increase for attendants. So they committed to a wage increase anywhere from 10 to 50 cents per hour. And they all really had bought into this idea that, all of this would ultimately contribute to, lower turnover and just a better quality of care. So we were very excited about moving forward with this. They really were all on board. And yeah, I think that the next step from there was to really target the attendant consumer pairs. So, one of the things that, like Cheryl mentioned, was we did some recruitment, some very targeted recruitment around attendant consumer pairs who felt like this would work for them at the time, because of various things going on in everybody's lives. We wanted to make sure this was something they were committed to. So that was one of the points. Again, I just spoke to that. The standardization of the replication was really important to us. And then this big piece, which I'll spend a little bit of time talking about, was incorporating this literacy component into the curriculum, which was something that we hadn't done with our work previously with Liberty Resources, but with our statewide grant we did partner with TIU 11 in Pennsylvania near Harrisburg, who worked with us to go through the curriculum and identify areas where we could integrate some literacy components and just some basic skills components, because I think that we were all in agreement, and consumers and attendants as well, that we wanted to ensure, well, we knew that everybody was going to come into the training with a range of learning levels, and they may have been out of school, for extended periods of time. So by incorporating some of these basic skills into the curriculum, we're hoping that we would see, just kind of an increase in, maybe the way medications were read, or things would start to shift a little bit, and they may actually begin to have conversations about next steps with in their education. And so we partnered in each of these counties with a literacy agency, so an organization who provided us with an education coach, who then would work with the RN to teach the curriculum. And so I think I'm going to talk a little bit more about what the role of that education coach was, but just to kind of go through these points, the wage increase was the other, big commitment from the CILs, and then we were expected to, evaluate outcomes and impact of the training, which we were able to do at the end. So what we committed to doing was developing this curriculum. So it ended up being 85 hours, 77 were the core training, and that included some time up front for each CIL to incorporate their own independent living philosophy, and then we left 8 hours for CPR first aid for the consumers and attendants. And we were targeting 120 attendants. So that would be 12 cohorts. So each CIL, we had 6 CILs participating. Each CIL would do 2 cohorts with 10 attendants and 10 consumers. And so this, this looked a little different CIL to CIL. What we ended up finding at some of the rural CILs was that there were transportation barriers, and in some cases it just became a bit much for consumers to make it to every class. but they actually, always encourage their attendants to come. And so it looked a little different, I think, than we envisioned because of just logistically where consumers and attendants were located. The weather played a role. If this was the middle of the summer, it was going to be a little more difficult for folks to get out. So all of that played a role into into our attendant population. But this was absolutely what we targeted, the 120. The training cohorts each still hosted 2, and then our partnership with that literacy agency, which was, I think it was huge because the education coach was bringing in particular elements around adult education, around facilitating a classroom that in some cases the RN didn't have. They were coming from a more medical background, so they were able to co-teach and work together. So the role of the education coach, we requested that the education coach teach half of the curriculum with the occupational instructor, so with the nurse. And in some cases, again, it varies still to still. In some cases, the education coaches ended up, being there more. They either volunteered their own time or their literacy agency was committed to, putting up the funds to allow them to be there more because they really did see a value. And in others, it looked a little different where they did stick a little more strictly to that half time. But the idea was that they were going to provide literacy support and coaching for the participants. So even when they weren't teaching, if they weren't actually facilitating the class, having them in the room allowed, if questions had to come up, if there were people in the class where English might not be their first language, that literacy, that education coach was there to kind of do some one-on-one support or some small group work. And we really, when you have a group of 20-some people potentially, it's always the more instructors, the better. And so, having the 2 of them there really helped balance the needs of the participants. We also expected that they do some pre and post testing. So that's the test of adult basic education, the TABE test. And we asked that they test the attendance up front and that they also test attendance at the end. And consumers were welcome to take the test as well. Often it was just kind of people like to kind of see where they are when they start and take a test at the end, we found, so they appreciated that feedback. We weren't necessarily doing a formal written test. We had skills tests throughout. So this was an opportunity for them to actually take a test and see if there had been some progress. So that was the role of the education coach to facilitate that. And then they also worked with the students who were interested in identifying next steps to resources in their region. So yeah, so that was helpful. Cheryl and I are in Philadelphia. If there were needs that occurred in the Pittsburgh area, there were folks who had a sense of the climate there.
So this is Cheryl. I just wanted to talk a little bit more about this. So Makita, by the way, managed and directed this whole statewide initiative. It was a huge initiative, and it was incredible to see it roll out across the state and really engage people from such diverse backgrounds, rural and urban, and people of different ages and different ethnicities, and it was a phenomenal effort. Getting this literacy support and these education coaches was amazing. And why I say that is, I described the dynamic in the class where you have these joint consumer attendant pairs. And at the same time, there are issues around learning itself. And as an educational institution, we're really sensitive to those learning issues, and we want to support people in really having a really good learning experience. At the time when we were rolling out the initial project statewide, we were being funded by the State Department of Labor. And I had a conversation with the Department of Education in Pennsylvania, and I said to them, geez, I have this dream if we could have 2 teachers in the room and have one focus on kind of the occupational training and the other on the educational process. It would be so phenomenal to try that out. And they responded, and they were willing to pilot this work statewide. The literacy agencies that came on board were really thrilled to be part of it. The teaching team of the registered nurse and the education coach became such a strong part of the program that added a totally different part of the project that hadn't existed in our original Building Bridges program. And so I would just say to you that this whole process of developing this design and getting this level of support for the home care training was really unique, and I think proved very successful. It costs money, and our current state administration has no interest in it. But at the time, we had a lot of support from the state, and if in New York State you have an administration that is open to this kind of thing, it's really an incredible opportunity to do something extremely unique.
So the slide in front of you is really a slide that shows an example of how we integrated literacy instruction, in what might be considered an occupational training. And so, where we could, we were able to put in reading strategies, for example, around following directions. If things were being taught around measurements or medication distribution, we were able to incorporate some skills into there, some fractions and decimals. If you're taking temperatures, that was incorporated. And then the other example that I put, and this was just kind of a couple that we pulled out of the big curriculum, but how you can use math to change the quantity of a solution being made. So these are a couple examples of how that became integrated into the larger curriculum. So starting it up was a big lift for us. We were here in Philadelphia, and we were working with SILs across the state. And so what we quickly did was really get to know the needs of each SIL and their capacity. Each SIL is very, very different. They each kind of have a different approach. Some of them function much more as a community center. Others are, a place really of advocacy and more political work is happening. So we had to understand really what each SIL's capacity and, kind of the energy and how things worked there. And then we customized the delivery for each SIL. So if we knew that one of the SILs there was going to be transportation issues, and this was a real issue that was in August, and people couldn't wait outside for half an hour, which was the amount of time they had to wait for their pickup, that we had to shift things a little bit. So we were very, very flexible, in everything from the startup and the initial design and delivery, all the way through the training. And also, we understood that each SIL, their approach was a bit different. So some of them, and this was for the instructors as well, some of them were a lot more comfortable maybe with, interactive didactic training, and some had more traditional approaches. And so, we spent a lot of time working with each of the instructors around that. We were very instrumental in hiring and training the instructors, and to some extent the literacy, the education coaches as well. So one of the things that we did, which I really think set the tone and brought everybody on the same page, was to conduct up front a train the trainer session for the instructor, for the occupational, for the RNs, and for the education coaches to come together and spend 2 days with us in Harrisburg and really work together, begin to understand the curriculum, begin to understand what the objectives were, and hear from each other around what their approach would be. And so this helped ground them. I mean, if you can imagine if you're going to jump into teaching and working with somebody who they didn't know each other, there was a lot of kind of relationship building for them that had to happen. And I think that it really gave us a sense of what some of the challenges would be at each SIL, and then how to really tailor our technical assistance, which we provided throughout the training here at the Training Fund. We were able to tailor that to each SIL. So throughout the program, some of the things that we used to really move towards the standardization and we used to govern it was the development of this project advisory council. So early on, many of the consumers, attendants, instructors took a particular interest in kind of developing this out to a different level and doing different iterations of the training, and there was a lot of excitement around it. So there was this project advisory council that met consistently. We established evaluation metrics, and again, that was a very collaborative process around what made the most sense to look at. One of the big things that the SILs were interested in was retention, and so we talked a bit about how can we increase retention, how can we reduce incidents. So those were all things that we had discussions about figuring out how to measure, and then formalizing that the wage increases was the big thing that we asked across all 6 SILs to happen. And then career advancement as part of the training model. We did ask that the education coaches and the RNs had a sense of what the next step would be. And so they were prepared and could talk about with attendance if they wanted to continue, what would be the best step educationally and where they would transition into. So here are the outcomes, and this was from the statewide building bridges in Pennsylvania that spanned over about a year. So I said our goal was originally to enroll 120. We enrolled 115. Out of that 115, 101 attendants received certification. And the number of consumers enrolled in the training were 40. And again, I think I mentioned a little earlier that that was in part to, I think what we realized quickly was the demographic challenge for some of the rural sites and getting the consumers there regularly, because the training, there were a couple of, if they were 4 hours a day, the consumers often didn't want to be away that long. We had to account for lunch. So there were a lot of different factors that we took into consideration, but the 40 was for the statewide was lower than it had been traditionally with building bridges when we did it in Philadelphia. And so here's a little bit more numbers related to our outcomes. So 82% of our attendants and consumers reported an increase in their understanding of the independent living philosophy. I think even consumers didn't have the fullest sense of what the independent living philosophy was and what it really meant to direct their own care. And so, we were thrilled that they were leaving with a better sense of that and a better sense of really, directing this, advocating for themselves, and what their choices were. 75% of attendants and consumers reported seeing an improvement in their relationship. So, like we talked about, this is really grounded in the relationship building, and we wove this throughout the curriculum. So again, to see that 75% actually reported seeing an improvement from the time they started to the end, was a huge step. And then 60% of attendants reported an interest in continuing their education. And so, we heard again and again that the attendants wanted more training. The consumers wanted the attendants to have more training. And so, they were very eager and very excited about continuing opportunities. And whether it was the SIL offering refresher courses or, additional modules on specific skills, they really wanted to continue their education on that level, but also in a lot of cases at the community college level. So these are a couple quotes that consumers and attendants, we have tons, and we actually have a really great video too, which we can send the link out afterwards, where you get to hear in their own voice some of the feedback. But the consumer learns just as much as the attendant and gets a better understanding of what attendants go through. And that was from a consumer from the SIL of Central PA. And then attendant who said, they wish this class went longer. The teachers were great. They listened to all of our questions and never lost hope in us. I would do any other training that would benefit me and my consumer as long as it was this interesting. So, I mean, that was one. I mean, that feedback was great because we did spend quite a bit of time, throughout the training, figuring out the best way to keep everyone engaged. We really wanted the consumers to play a role, and it ended up happening where they, in many cases, became the teacher, and the nurse and the education coach would turn the floor over to them and say, why don't you come up and you actually can teach this module. And so it really was an amazing, amazing thing to see.
A couple of questions.
Yeah,
Perfect timing.
questions. Great.
Perfect timing. So you talked earlier about some of the training components. Could you talk just a little bit about your thoughts or experience with consciousness raising or political education training about the systemic issues faced by care workers, elders, and people with disabilities? Was that part of your core curriculum?
Yeah, so it wasn't part of the core curriculum. One of the things that we didn't talk about, but United Homecare Workers of Pennsylvania, which is a partnership between SEIU and AFSCME, supported and promoted the training throughout. And they, are very, very aware of the issues related to wage increase, the issues related to time off, and each of the SILs who participated in the training were involved with the United Homecare Workers of Pennsylvania on different levels at that time. So we, throughout the training, I would say at least twice, maybe in the beginning and at the end, we had organizers come and talk about some of the activities that were going on that consumers and attendants could get involved with. And petitions were signed around wage increases. And so it's at a completely different point now. I mean, I think because of some of the things that have happened at a state level, it's slowed down a bit, but there's definitely work still being done. And so while it wasn't part of the core curriculum, we invited that element in and made sure that at each of the SILs there were conversations happening.
So the SILs standing for the Centers for Independent Living?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
How did you recruit them? How were they selected to participate?
This is Cheryl. So the first relationship started with Liberty Resources. And I would have to say that the initial recruitment was a long and not easy process because there is a part of the disabled advocacy community that really does not support the idea of training, because training is viewed by some as this isn't a word, but disempowering the consumer and making consumer, training that would not support the role of the consumer in directing their own care and putting the attendant in the power position. And so building trust, building the relationships, and working together, because we developed together this idea of joint consumer attendant training. Coming up through many, many hours of discussion with that idea together was the initial kind of kicking off point of us being able to work together. The training fund had approached Liberty Resources in Philadelphia, basically cold call, because we believed that as a training institution we had a role to play in ensuring that there was opportunities for attendants to get an education and have access to continuing education and career advancement. So that initial relationship took time to build, and then together building the curriculum. Once we had a few years of experience under our belt working together, we then were able to approach the rest of the SILs in the state with the idea of replicating the Building Bridges model statewide. And that was really a self-selection process because Liberty talked to their colleagues throughout the state in bigger meetings and in one-on-one meetings, and they really, it really came down to which SILs felt they had the capacity and desire to participate in this pilot. And so out of those discussions, 6 SILs, including Liberty, came forward out of the 20-some in the state. And I believe that if we had an administration in Harrisburg that was supportive of this, we would be working with more SILs now because the project was so successful. But unfortunately, the ending of the grant coincided with a changeover in the state administration.
Another question about the model of consumer and caregiver training. Did the consumers get a better appreciation for the caregivers' experience as workers?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was a lot of the feedback that we received was that, you know, not only where I think their we encouraged and fostered conversations to happen throughout the training about, you know, each other's experience, but they also got to see firsthand through, you know, as the skills were being taught, what this really involved and the level of detail it involved, and so they actually, I mean, we encouraged throughout opportunity for them to tell each other, you know, and share with each other that they were beginning to understand. So, you know, they actually had conversations about, you know, yeah, I get this now in a different way. So I think, I'm sure that they left with a clear understanding and appreciation. And we should add that, you know, I would say we don't have the exact percentage, but it's extremely high, the percentage of consumer and attendant pairs who are family members. So in many cases, in the picture I think you're looking at now, that's a mother and son team. In many cases, there were, you know, siblings with siblings. There were, you know, a mother caring for a son caring for a mother, a husband and wife team. At one of the SILs, it was a team. We had a team of a mother and a grandmother, and then a team of their daughter, the mother's daughters. So, I mean, this really was becoming, you know, there were so many levels to this from a relationship perspective that we had to address. And, you know, what are some boundaries? What are people comfortable with? All of that came up.
So I have a couple of related questions around the literacy component. So I think there are about 3 I'll give you at once. Was the literacy component geared toward English language learners or folks who had just not had adequate literacy education earlier in life? And then was there a difficult dynamic created in situations where the consumer had a higher level of literacy and education than the attendant?
Yeah.
I'll start off. This is Cheryl. So the literacy component was flexible in terms of working with whatever the needs were of both the consumers and the attendants in the class. In some cases, it was the reverse, where the attendant had higher level of knowledge and skills than the or education than the consumer. But ESL was particularly, I remember, in the Philadelphia cohorts, particularly an issue. And we didn't have education coaches in our Philadelphia classes originally. And it was actually one of the things that convinced me that it would be a good thing, because I felt that some of the attendants who had ESL needs maybe didn't get as much out of the original Building Bridges classes as they might have if there had been an education coach in the room. There is a large segment of home care providers that are immigrants, so it definitely is a need. How many of our attendants had ESL needs, I think, was certainly at a smaller number than attendants who had literacy needs themselves, but we also had a lot of consumers benefiting from the education coach as well. And so it really was not limited to just the attendants.
Yeah, and it was very integrated throughout, and so I don't recall there ever being a tension or any discomfort because there were in some cases consumers who had I think there was one who had a PhD and was now in this situation, and we encourage. I mean, I think that we worked with I worked with the instructors to really encourage and support them in figuring out ways to include the consumer as much as possible, and to really, if they had expertise they were bringing, to really incorporate that into their teaching. So, I mean, I think that in some cases, maybe some days it was the occupational instructor, it was the nurse and the education coach, but other days it was a consumer who really felt like they wanted to take the lead on this, and the nurse, or the consumer and the education coach. And so it looked really different still to still, but we encouraged that flexibility, and we worked with the instructors to support that.
In relation to that question on customizing and the different SILs and their training models, exactly how long did the training last over time? You talked about the hours, but what was the framework of how long, over what period of time?
Yeah, the average was 4 months. In some cases, SILs finished a little quicker, and it was maybe 3 months, or in some cases it pushed to 5. But the average was 4 months, and they generally met twice a week for about 3 to 4 hours a week. And some SILs made it a very communal thing, and they did potlucks once a week when they came, or they had a very minimal food budget and would maybe do like a hot dog or hamburger, and they were always getting feedback from the nurse about how to make it nutritious, but so it was twice a week. Most of the SILs did a twice-a-week model over 4 months.
So could a care worker attend without their consumer?
Yes. I mean, we liked if the consumer came up front to a couple and just really got a sense of what the training was, but in some cases the consumer said, I'm fine with not being there, and I'd like my consumer to attend, and we supported that.
There was a question here about 25% of people who didn't report an improved relationship. Was their relationship good to begin with? Did it have no impact, or did it have a negative impact?
The question around the improved relationship was,
yes.
It was a little, so we asked on a sliding scale. So we did some upfront surveys, and then we asked at the end, we used a sliding scale. So we asked them on a scale, I think we used 1 to 5. I don't remember exactly what the measurement was, but we asked them to rate what they would consider, where they would consider their relationship. And I think we broke it out a little more specifically in the survey, but we asked them to do where it was before, and then when they concluded where they identified change happening. And so that's where that number comes from. The folks who said that maybe it was a 3 or 4 to begin with, and now it was a 5. So it didn't necessarily, nobody really reported it, or very few people, if any, who said a 1, but there had been some incremental increase.
So now I have a broader question to ask you about were there major gaps or shortcomings of the programs, things that you would do differently next time upon reflection? It sounds like it's just a great model.
So this is Cheryl. So one of the things to think about in doing a program like this is the time commitment, because it is a big time commitment. And when Liberty became a home care agency and we weren't able to do so many hours, we reduced the program to 32 hours. Right, and we were able to do it full-time for 1 week. And what happened and that was just attendance, no consumers. And what happened in that model was that we were able to teach the basic technical skills and the basic, foundational skills to providing home care, and the important red flags and things people needed to know about safety, etc. But all the stuff about relationship building and ethical dilemmas and dealing with having the time for role plays around impairment issues and, the rich partnership development, that didn't exist. And so I say this because we provide thousands of hours of training every year to folks, and a lot of organizations and individuals often want a quick fix. Let's do something quick. And sometimes you can decide to pick out something that you think is really important and just focus on that, or you can modularize it and offer it throughout a year period. You can do it in so many different ways, but I would say that the 2 lessons that I learned was that relationship building of the caregiving partnership was really important to this initiative, and figuring out a way to keep that would be, in my mind, important if this model were to be replicated. It doesn't have to be all these hours, because we were really doing a comprehensive best practice that we could think of in terms of all the technical skills, building some career awareness and industry knowledge, as well as the relationship building. So we were doing it all because we had the resources to do it, but it certainly could be lesser hours as long as you were clear on what your goals were and what you wanted your outcomes to be. So the lesson learned for me is there's no one right way to do something, but you got to be clear on your goals and objectives and ensure that you're at least not giving short shrift to those. So that was one thing that I learned. I also learned, I guess I got a greater appreciation for the complexity of the relationship from a family perspective, certainly, but also when there are not family members involved. And that part of the home care, I guess, what would I call it, dilemma, is that you're having somebody take care of you on an intimate level and also share your space. And and I've experienced that as a child of an elderly person myself. And so having the wherewithal to really explore that in a meaningful way is a real gift. I would say another lesson learned, and then I'll turn it to Makita for her thoughts, is that this is very time-consuming to organize. And especially if you're going to customize it, you have to have an organization that's willing to put in the time to organize it, and to find the right instructors. If you don't have the right instructors, it doesn't work. The Train the Trainer that Makita developed herself was phenomenal in really ensuring that those instructors got up to speed on the approach that we wanted and had a chance to practice that approach and get feedback on it. So putting the time in for professional development, the time in to organize it, ensuring that the consumers have a voice throughout, from the design phase and throughout, was very important lesson for us. I'll turn it to Makita.
Yeah, and that last point I'll just piggyback on, because that was really, I think, for me, the major lesson learned was that, this is a really tough class to teach. And I think instructors who may have been teaching for years walk into this classroom, and it's a whole different dynamic. And so I think that I realized in it the amount of support instructors needed, and we hadn't necessarily built in for that. And so what we ended up doing was partnering with a SIL in Pittsburgh, around the Pittsburgh area, who was able to offer some support and TA to those SILs in that region, because provide support to a total of 12 instructors just across the state who needed a lot more, like I said, than I think we anticipated. We kind of had to adjust for in the moment. And so that was really, for me, the major learning, just to really build that in and make sure that we were able to offer as much support and kind of brainstorming with them, and just reassuring them that, yeah, like the class didn't go as planned today, but what came out of that, what did you learn, what did that look like? And they really, across the state, built a nice community and were able to support each other. We brought them together not only for the Train the Trainer, but we did a lessons learned, kind of roundtable towards the end, and they got to share their experiences. So, I mean, my hope for them, and also for the consumers and attendants involved, was really to begin to build this community that could support this and that understood this training and this process.
So I have a question about budget and the total cost of the program and how long it took to actually develop the program. Both planning and implementation, and the cost that might have been built in for the planning in addition to the implementation.
Well, the whole statewide grant, implementing it in 6 SILs, cost $250,000. That was over the course of a year's project. It was a very generous grant, and allowed us to bring people to Harrisburg several times and do the extra support Makita was talking about with the instructors. Believe it or not, the education coach funding was separate from that. So each literacy provider got $5,000 per cohort to involve the education coach as well. So this best practice model is not cheap. When it comes to the building bridges that we offered at Liberty Resources, I'm remembering this, I could be somewhat wrong, but I think it was about $15,000 per cohort. And that included included the instruction and the administrative costs. That did not include the wage increases, the transportation. And again, we took this very seriously in terms of providing high levels of support. It can be done a lot cheaper, a lot cheaper. This is the best practice model. And again, deciding on what you're able to do based on the resources, and anything can be developed either using scarce resources and a lot of in-kind, or getting more substantial resources. But one thing I tell funders is you're usually going to get what you pay for. And one reason that building bridges and the statewide project was so incredibly successful is because it had resources behind it. So how long did it take to develop this initially? I don't totally recollect because it was a number of years ago, but I would say several months. And initially, as I explained previously, it took much longer than it would normally take us because we had to win over some recalcitrant folks who weren't really sure they wanted to get involved in a training partnership. And then we also held like focus groups with consumers to get their input on the design. Nothing moved forward without the input of consumers when we initially designed it. And that was time well spent, because by the time we actually were ready to deliver the training, everybody was on board, ready to go, all on the same page, and really excited about it. So the initial planning over the course of maybe 6 or 7 months, or maybe it was even a year, was well worth the time that it took initially to get it off the ground.
A couple of questions around your vision of where you might have gone had the funding not been cut. And great appreciation for this awesome presentation from the Elder Care Consortium.
Well, thank you. It's our honor and pleasure to do it. So let's see. I guess I'll let Makita speak also, but I would have definitely wanted to continue the education coach. I thought it was a phenomenal model. I would have wanted to expand to beyond the 6 sills to additional sills. I think I would have wanted to use more technology. So whether they be webinars or recorded webinars, having opportunities for people to, in the rural areas especially, not just depend on being present if they had to miss a session. So I think technology could become a larger part of the program. I think I would have wanted to move the program into new hire training, not just the folks already working with consumers. And one of the things we did in Philly, and I would have wanted to replicate statewide if we could, is to, for those consumers that went through it who really took a liking to the instructional piece, to use them as part of the faculty, you know, going forward as part of the teaching team, so that it really became not just something that we were doing from the outside, but also was part of the infrastructure of the SILS activities. I'll turn it over to Makita.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, that with that curriculum piece, I think that what we started to do towards the end, because this really was kind of the first time that we were piloting it, was to do some additional work and put the curriculum through a couple more iterations. So we didn't really get a chance to do that, and I know, you know, both the consumers and attendants who went through we asked them, but really up front, that you're really the first round of this. This is a learning for us. We'd like to continue to meet with you or maybe form a committee who can make some adjustments and give us feedback. And so I would have loved to have been able to continue that and really strengthen the curriculum and get their feedback in a different way than we were able to do. And the other piece, I think, which we had started to do, but again, it depended on the SIL, was really to institutionalize this model because some of the SILs, because of resources, maybe didn't have an RN on staff who could teach and ended up hiring a consultant to come in. And so, that consultant left with that knowledge, and the SIL has not retained it to the same level as maybe a SIL who had an RN who's still there and can still incorporate some of this learning. So I think we were starting to, in those cases, as the training wrapped up, really get the leadership to understand the value and to sit in on trainings and to really get what this was about, even though they hadn't participated for the full 4 months. So I think, for sure that was a piece that we could have continued to work on, was really getting them, and perhaps we'd even talked about doing some training for them to really get them to understand at a leadership level, and really all staff, what this training was about.
So I have a technical question about the TABE test, and what does that test exactly?
Sure. It's a McGraw-Hill test that's used in adult literacy programs, and there is a reading comprehension section, a math computation, applied math, which is basically word problems, and language arts. And we needed to do that test because we were getting literacy dollars for the education coach, and that's the requirement of the state, that if you're getting literacy dollars, you have to pre and post students on the TABE. But we also developed pre and post tests, skills test for the actual home care curriculum. And that was relevant, obviously, to the curriculum that was being taught, because although we were incorporating literacy, we really didn't have a typical standardized literacy instruction. It turned out people did go up on their TABE scores, and the state was really happy about it, but we didn't teach for that. And, it happened because people were engaged and thinking and really, I think, getting more self-confidence in their ability to interact on a different level.
We have 6 minutes left because we talked about ending at 7:10. And there's one question I want to ask, and then I want to turn it over to folks to send their last-minute questions if they'd like, and then to thank our speakers for their, Makita and Cheryl, for your generosity of spirit and time, and our partners, the Elder Care Dialogue Coalition, and we look forward to moving forward in exciting ways that we might take this in directions that make sense for our Elder Care Dialogue Consortium and partnership with Cornell, and we look forward to exploring ways that we all might work together. So the quick question is, in reaching out, you mentioned a little bit around the rural consumers, and any final thoughts around strategies to reach isolated consumers who are isolated either through geography or reluctant to engage in something like this? What are some ways to do that kind of outreach?
Yeah, I mean, so the United Home Care Workers did a really beautiful job in outreaching. I mean, part of that included going to, consumers' homes and having conversations with them about the training, about the work that they were doing. And then also they were starting to incorporate video. So one of the things that we were talking about, and I think it is still on the table, is to figure out, are there some videos that consumers and attendants can do together to start to get them engaged? And maybe they don't have to come to all of the trainings, but is there some work that can start to happen at the home? And so, you know, those are some preliminary conversations that we've started to have about it. But it is tough. I mean, it's definitely tough in those rural communities where transportation is an issue, and you know, things like weather prevent people from, you know, getting where they need to go, doctor's appointments, let alone the still for a training. So, yeah, I think we're just trying constantly to be flexible and to, where possible, you know, make accommodations. It was tough to do makeup. I know that came up at some of the SILs where they wanted the opportunity to do, you know, maybe one day a week or here and there if there were people who missed it and wanted to make it up. But because of, you know, budget restrictions and time, it was tough to do that. But that's another way to think about it too, is just to, you know, incorporate additional options in for people.
So in the last 3 minutes, Makita or Cheryl, any final parting remarks, reflections?
No, we wish you good luck, and let us know if we can be of any further assistance.
Thank you, and I want to thank Alice Torres, our Rock of Gibraltar, who made this whole webinar possible. Kudos to Alice and everyone who made this happen as well. Have a great night, everyone.